series of 6 key assessments that taken as a whole demonstrate that candidates know and are able to do the elements found within the standards 1.0 through 6.0. And there's that evaluation rubric found in Appendix 1. I mentioned that and showed it to you. And then does the program provide documentation of its clinical internship field experience? Section 1, question 2, that's where they should answer 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3. And again, look at the evaluation rubric in Appendix 1, which I showed you as well. Okay, before I get into writing the recognition report, Barbara asked a great question. She says, if grades in courses are used for content knowledge assessment, is a pass-fail grade sufficient? Okay, good question. I'm going to get out of this for a moment because what I'd like to do is to show you this document here. And I sent it to you via email. And this is called Guidelines for Using and Documenting Course Grades as an Assessment of Candidate Content Knowledge. I don't want to confuse you, but I told you that assessments have 3 parts. They have the assessment description activity, they have the scoring guide, and they have the data table. Well, that is the case for most all of the assessments. However, NCATE or CAPE allows institutions to submit grades as one of the content assessments. It usually will be assessment number 2. In some cases, it might be assessment number 1 if they don't have state licensure exam. But in any case, one of the 2 content assessments, NCATE CAPE does allow for them to submit course grades. However, they have this document here for how it needs to be set up. So course grades assessment looks different from all of the other assessments. And here's the format. So when submitting course grades, the institution must submit Part 1, which is the description of this assessment, and there they must describe the courses that they're using, and they need to provide a rationale for how the course is aligned to specific SPA, in this case ELCC standards. Okay? Part 2 is an alignment, and you'll see these 2 charts. These are the charts that NCATE CAPE gives to them for how they could submit information vis-a-vis alignment. Okay? One of the most common ones is this example number 1. And basically here they list the courses down the side. They tell which standard elements they're addressing within that course. And then you see the 3rd column that says brief description of how the course meets cited standards. That is where you're going to find the evidence of the alignment to each of those standards. So in this case, they don't have to tell you what candidates are doing. They have to tell you what they teach in that course, and usually it comes from the course syllabi. But here's where they're going to tell you what they teach in that specific course vis-a-vis each one of those standards listed in the 2nd column. And many times you will not find sufficient evidence because when I'm talking about being specific, I'm talking about being specific to the standard element concept. What does that mean, you say? Okay, let's go back to our standards. Let me just jump in here. Let's say that 2nd column said they were aligned to 1.1 and 1.2. Well, basically, we're looking for what they teach in that course that relates to candidates' understanding of developing, articulating, implementing, and stewarding a shared district vision, 1.1. And we're looking for what they teach in that course around what they teach about collecting, using data to identify district goals, assessing organizational effectiveness, and implementing district plans. That's what I mean by aligning it to the concept contained in the standard element. And that 3rd column there, whoops, let me go back. That 3rd column there, they might say things like, well, here's a course objective we have that aligns to that element. Or here's a reading assignment on visioning. So it doesn't have to be exact same words, but it would have to be something to do with visioning, developing, articulating, implementing vision. It would have to be something about collecting data, that sort of thing. So You're just going to read whatever it is they submit and then judge whether it addresses that concept, okay? Not every time, they don't have to use every single word in that element, but they would have to get the gist of the concept. Just, you know, what's the concept for this element? And are they teaching something around that concept, okay? So that's what we want to see in that third column for each one of those elements they list in the second column, okay? Part 3 is their grading policy. And Part 4 is the data table that is the candidates who took those courses, how well they did. Okay, you will notice this data chart doesn't have anything to do with our standards, and that's okay. It's really not meant for that, for this particular assessment. We're really up here looking for that alignment to our standards in this part up here under alignment. Down here, we're just looking to see that there's sufficient data and what that data says about this candidate's proficiency. So if in the data chart, if they have a system of pass-fail, that's fine. Again, you know, this is the way CAPE asks them to detail those charts. So Barbara, in answer to your question, if they provide you a data chart that doesn't look like one of these two things, it would not be acceptable. So if somehow they can get a pass-fail in here and it somehow looks like this, then yes. You will notice that there are 3 levels of data, and CAPE does not require 3 levels anymore. They have to submit 2 applications of data. So, but the idea is that they look something like these charts. If it doesn't, then you're going to have to say that the program assessment data chart does not align to the standards outlined by CAPE for using and grading course grades, or using and submitting course grades. Okay, so this document is called Guidelines for Using and Documenting Course Grades as an Assessment of Candidate Content Knowledge. Okay, so become very familiar with those requirements. They were written by CAPE, not the ELCC. And they're used for all assessments 1 or 2 that use course grades. Can course grades be used for any of the other assessments? No. Okay, why? Because course grades is only allowed to be used as this assessment. Course grades is not allowed to be used for any of the other assessments. You can't use course grades again and again and again in your data charts. The data charts have to align to the assessments that they design. Okay? And the data goes from the scoring guide that they use. So there's just some tips. So just keep writing those questions in. This is really good. I hope you're getting a lot out of this, okay? I'd like to go back to my PowerPoint presentation now, and let's talk, well, before I do that, I would like to show you one other document, and that is the, I've showed you the standards, this document. This is the program report template that institutions use to submit their program report. Okay, so they will complete one of these, and this is what they will submit in the AIMS system, and this is what you're going to open up. Okay, only it'll be completed. It'll be filled in. And you will notice that the overview section of the report is what you're looking at right now. Up here in this column, you'll see this gray box in here, and you'll see this little paper clip. See that? That is where your assessments are attached. So when you get your assignment and you open up your program report, click on this little tab and look at all the assessments that will be listed. Then you can click on them, and there'll be Assessment 1, Assessment 2, Assessment 3, Assessment 4, Assessment 5, Assessment 6. And basically your job is to go through each one of those assessments and evaluate it and make comments on it, okay? But before we get into that, I want to just go over the parts of this report, okay? So you got this overview section, and right here you will see number 14, whether it's an initial report or whether it's a further development required or recognized with probation or recognized with conditions. Be sure you look at that right when you open it up to see what kind of report you're doing. Are you doing an initial review or a conditional report or a revised report? Okay. Here's another. Number 16 is hugely is a big question, and that is, do they have a state licensure exam for this program? If they do, then assessment number 1 should be the state licensure exam results. If they don't, then they would say no, in assessment number 1 would be another content assessment. So be sure you look at that, okay? Then we have section 1, context, and they're going to give you information on each one of these questions. Look at number 2. Number 2 is about the clinical field experience, and that's where you should see responses for ELCC standards 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3. So you'd read that through, you'd apply your rubric, your evaluation rubric from Appendix 1 to that description, and then you would decide whether 7.1 is met or not met, or 7.2 is met or not met, and 7.3 is met or not met. Okay? And there's the faculty information, and this is where I was saying that sometimes people want to make comments about faculty, and there's a place for that in the report. I'll show you where that is, and that's okay, I guess, but be very circumspect about that. Here's section 2 is where they're going to list all of their assessments. They're going to give you the name of the assessment, what kind it is, and where it is in the program. And then section 3, CAPE asks them to, for each one of their assessments to decide which assessment is going to cover which standard. So standard 1.0 has 4 elements, and you should see 2 check marks in each one of these. And 1 check mark should be for content, and another check mark should be for measuring leadership skills. So remember, assessments 1 and 2 are content assessments, and assessments 3, 4, 5, and 6 are skill assessments. So somewhere between those 6 assessments, you should have 2 check marks for each standard, 1 for content and 1 for skill. Then there's the internship part. Then we get section 4, directions. These are the directions to the institution for how to set up each of their assessments that are over here in their Word documents or PDFs. And you will see this right in here. There's an overview, 2-page overview section that comes at the beginning of every assessment. And in it, you'll get a description of the assessment. It'll tell you which standards it's aligning to. It'll give you an analysis of the data findings and an interpretation of how the data provides evidence. Then you have these attachments. They're not actually attachments. They're just the next pieces. And the first part says the assessment tool or a rich description of this. This is basically where they give you the directions to the candidates for that assessment, for completing that assessment. So I call them assessment activities. They should outline all the assessment activities and tasks and all the things the candidates have to do for that assessment. And they should align each piece of those tasks to specific standard elements that they're trying to measure. Okay? And then the next piece of it is F2F is the scoring guide. And the scoring guide is used by the faculty members for evaluating what candidates write in the assessment description. So they're given directions for completing the assessment. The candidates go ahead and submit something for each of that, and then that gets evaluated using a scoring guide. In most cases, it's a rubric that faculty use. So the scoring guide has to relate back to the assessment activity, and it has to relate to measuring candidates on specific standard elements. And then lastly, the charts, those are data charts. And the data charts come from using the scoring guide. So the data charts should align to the scoring guide and the rubric, however they've set that up. And they are required for an initial report to give you 2 applications of data. If it's a revised report or conditional report, they only have to give 1 application of data. So anyway, you are going to get 6 assessments that are formatted like this, unless it's a grade assessment. Okay? And that's going to be over here in this column, and you're going to click open every single one of those and look at them, and you're going to look for this information. All right? Over here, it kind of just tells the institution what assessments they have to be, and I've already kind of gone over that, okay? And then section 5, basically, CAPE asks them to write an analysis. They want the institution to look at the data, all the data charts for assessments 1 through 6. And they want them to look at all the data for content knowledge and analyze it and describe, how they are going to use that data to make improvements to individual individual candidates or to improve the program's content knowledge. And then they want another section for them to describe, how their, the data looks across all the standards for leadership skills, assessments 3, 4, 5, and 6. And they want them to analyze that and provide you some information on how that data is being used to improve the program and to improve candidate leadership skills in our standards. And then the last section will talk about Assessment 5, student learning, that data, and what that data says about the candidate's student learning knowledge, content, leadership skills, So you're going to review this narrative, and you are going to decide whether the data does indeed show you that this program is accurately and proficiently measuring candidates' content knowledge and leadership skills and their ability to affect student learning. What does that say about the program as a whole? Or do they have a system in place for improving the program? Does the data, are they evaluating it and analyzing it correctly? So that's kind of where they would write that. Section 6 is only used for revised report or response to conditions reports. So that's the report that you receive. It's filled out. And I did want to go over that. So any questions on that? So the question, Andrea asks the question, so they do not want to know if they have to provide 3 years of passing the state licensure exam. Good question, Andrea. And CAPE has changed all the data rules to 2 applications of data, not 3. We used to be since 2004, they always had 3, but it hasn't been 3 applications of data for many years now. So everything now is 2 applications of data. Carol writes a question, Honor, is it only at the master's level, or does it include the doctorate level too? Yes, yes, yes. All data is also so reports could be submitted at the program report level, either for building or district, and they might be master's level, specialist level, or doctorate level. We look at any program, whatever level it is at, that prepares leaders. Okay, so Carol, just so that you know where that's found, and for all of you actually, where that is found is in the program report template right here. They will tell you what degree level this program is at, and those are all the degree levels that we look at. So that's hopefully answers your question. Let me go back now to, let's look at each of those sections in a little bit more detail in terms of how to write a quality reviewer report, because that's kind of where you're at, okay, as you're reviewing. So some questions, some tips for you. Oh, before I begin, though, Barbara asked a question. So if the program only has 1 set of data, they would not be eligible for recognition? It depends on whether it's an initial report or a revised report, Barbara. An initial report, a first-time review, they must submit 2 applications of data on all assessments, okay? If they have less than 2 applications, you would not be able to give them full national recognition. You would have to give them nationally recognized with conditions, or not nationally recognized if the assessment quality was really bad as well as lacking data, okay? So not nationally recognized is only given if there's major problems in many areas, both data and assessment quality. If the assessment quality is good and it's aligned to our standards, but they're lacking data, then it would be nationally recognized with conditions, okay? Now, the caveat on that is if you're looking at a conditional report or a revised report, we only require 1 application of data for whatever assessments they're resubmitting, okay? So just kind of get that in your head. An initial report, 2 applications of data. A conditional or revised report, only 1 application of data, okay? So that's kind of the unwritten data rule. And I've gotten that written down here a little bit later, okay? So let's, when you're looking at your report overall, the first thing you're going to open, when you open it up, look for completeness of the assessments, okay? If pieces are missing, maybe they didn't submit assessments. Maybe one of the 6 assessments, they didn't submit assessment 6. That's a problem. If they're missing pieces, let's say they didn't submit any of the scoring rubrics, or they didn't submit any data charts, the first thing you should do is to write to Elizabeth Vilke or myself and let us know that the report is not complete. And then we will decide whether to pull it from your review, contact the institution, or contact the institution and ask them to resubmit stuff for you to look at, or to just go ahead and plow through. And we'll make that call, okay? But the first thing you need to do is just open up all your reports, make sure you can get into all of your the reports and all the pieces, all the assessments, and that they're complete. If they're not complete, definitely shoot an email as quickly as possible to Elizabeth and myself. And there's the email right there at the end of the slide, okay? Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I need to be on my... as part A of the program report template, and this is the team report that you write, okay? Part A has everything to do about, the SPA decision, the test results, and strengths. And I have included a tip on this part. The ELCC really likes strengths. We like a well-rounded report. When you write a report, we don't want it just to be weaknesses or just to be strengths. We want you to write both the strengths and the areas of weakness, okay? So even if there aren't any strengths, don't leave that box blank, okay? Write something, and I've given you an example. So here's an example of a Part A. You'll notice the team decision is up above. In this case, I said further development required. You make a comment about the test results on whether yes, no, or not applicable. We want you to write comments, if necessary, regarding the test results, okay? And then here is an example of what was written for one report, and you will notice it says, unable to determine at this time, assessments were still aligned to the 2001 standards and have not been modified to meet the 2011 standards. I will tell you that we switched over about a year ago to the new 2011 standards, and we do now require all initial reports to be done on the 2011 standards. Unfortunately, for the next year or so, you will probably be seeing reports that are still using 2001 assessments. They're not supposed to be doing that. You'll want to make a note to yourself to look for that, because any initial report, all the assessments have to be done on 2011, not mix and match. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the last cycle or two is assessments, some assessments are done in 2001, some are done in 2011, some are mixed and matched within one assessment. Some pieces are 2001, some pieces are 2011. It's just kind of nasty looking. I'm sorry that that's probably going to be the case for you guys when this next cycle. I think gradually we'll get there, but this comment may be, if you find assessments that are using old standards and it's an initial report, a first-time review, then you definitely need to make comments and make note of which assessments are using which standards. If it's a conditional report or a revised report that you're looking at, they may have originally submitted using 2001 standards. And if that's the case, you would be using the 2001 ELCC standards to conduct your reviews. For this next cycle, I've asked NCAPE or CAPE staff not to assign you to 2001 conditional reports, okay? I don't want to confuse you. Okay, so hopefully you will not get that. If you do, just email me, let me know, and I'll take care of it. I'll reassign you or make sure that you're only reviewing 2011. So here was a case where they didn't really have any strengths, but they at least wrote something in that box, and that's what I want you to do. Hopefully you will be able to write in which assessments were done right and some strengths of the program, and that's what we want. Part B of the report is basically where you're checking off whether every standard is met with conditions or not met. And when I say standards, I'm talking about every specific element within a standard, okay? So basically my tip for you on this is that if you give them met with conditions or not met, you you must write in a comment in the comment box. And I've got an example of one right here. So each element, you're going to tell it whether it's met with conditions, or not met. If it's met with conditions or not met, you must write a comment in the comment box. And a lot of times the comments are related to the assessment. So if the comment is related to the assessment, here is a standard phrase that you can use, and you don't have to detail it all out in this section. You can just refer them to the section C, which is where you write comments about the quality of the assessment. The only place where you would not be able to do that is 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3, and that's because that's not related to the assessments, okay? And so there you would actually have to write out a narrative about each of the 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3 if you did met with conditions or not met. Don't leave any blank boxes unless it's met. And then be sure to fill in 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3 because that will tell the audit committee whether 7.0 is met or not. And remember, they can't get nationally recognized if standard 7 is not met. All the standards have to be met, 1.0 through 6.0 and 7.0. So it's very important for you to complete section B, 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3. Okay, Part C is the next most important section of the report, and that's where you're making judgment comments, evaluative comments about the quality of each of the assessments. Okay, Section C1 is about the content assessments, and that's specifically assessments 1 and 2. And you're going to write comments about each of those assessments on the quality of those in Part C1. In Part C1, you're going to make comments about the quality of the assessments on leadership skills, and those are assessments 3, 4, 5, and 6. And they go in, your comments for those assessments go in Part C2. And that's relative to our standards 1.0 through 6.0. And then Part C3 is a comment about assessment number 5. And that's the ability to create an effective learning environment for students from a leadership skill point of view. Okay? So those are the sections where your comments go in. And I've already kind of gone over this. I just copied this from the program report template. Again, remember, every assessment is set up like this. It's got a 2-page overview. It's got a 2E assessment tool or assessment activity, tasks. It's got a scoring guide, and it's got a data charts, whatever. And that's kind of, the standard setup for each of the assessments, unless they're using course grades, and I already showed you the setup for course grades. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about how to evaluate 2E, 2F, and 2G. And 2E is the assessment description or activities. Assessment 2F is the scoring guide or rubric, and 2G is the data charts. Okay, and I've got specific guidance for you on each of that. Okay, so when writing your comments for Part C, here in a nutshell is the comments for C1, C2, and C3. And basically, we're going to want a comment on each assessment. We're going to want a comment for assessment 1. We're going to want a comment for assessment 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And in those different sections, okay? And each comment should contain specific information on 3 things: the quality of the assessment activities and their alignment to our standards elements, the quality of the scoring guide or rubric and its relationship back to the activities, was it measuring those activities, and the alignment of that scoring rubric to our standards. And then third, the quality of the assessment data. Did they submit 2 applications or 1 application? Is that data related back to the scoring guide or the rubric that they used? What does the data say about the quality of the candidates, in terms of their knowledge level and skill level? So those are the 3 comments we want for every single assessment. Every single assessment should have those 3 parts in that comment. And I'll show you an example or 2. Here's an example for C1. Assessment 1, and you'll notice, they're talking about the CAT exam, which is the Connecticut State Licensure Exam. they're going to say 2 applications have been submitted and it exceeds the 80% pass rate. And that's what we're looking for. Assessment 2 is other content assessment. And you will notice that they wrote out what the assessment is, the name of the assessment, and then they put a period. And then they made a comment about the assessment activities in that first sentence. And then in the second sentence, they made a statement about the scoring rubric. In this case, it says that the rubric lumps elements together into one measurement, making it impossible to determine candidate mastery of any single standard. That's a very common problem. There's some wording that you can use if you ever see that lumping issue where they're grouping a whole bunch of elements together and measuring all of it at one time. If you do that, then you can't get any individual data on any single standard because you've just lumped them all into one massive measurement. Okay? And then they looked at the evaluative criteria within the levels of the rubric, and here they said they don't align to a majority of concepts outlined within each standard. Those are the diamonds, okay? And here's a standard phraseology that you can use. You can lift this wording and use it if you see that as a problem. So what I'm trying to do is give you some wording that you can use in your reports. You don't have to make it up from scratch. You can use some of the same wording that we have here if you find these problems. And these are very common problems that we find in assessments, so that's why I'm giving them to you. And then here, the third comment is about the quality of the data. 2 applications of data were provided and aligned to both the ELCC standards and the levels of the scoring rubric, okay? Again, the data has to apply back to the rubric. It can't just be data for data's sake. It has to actually show a relationship to the scoring rubric that they used or the scoring guide that they used, okay? And the scoring guide has to show some sort of relationship to the assessment activities. It can't just be a general scoring rubric for all the standards. It has to actually relate to the assessment activity, okay? Any questions on that? Feel free to write it in. Here's another example of different writing that somebody used for C2 now. But you'll notice, again, you'll notice that it gives you, they didn't actually tell us what the assessments were, but they did tell us, I think this was a conditional report, and I think it has something to do with the scoring rubrics. Okay, so they zeroed in right on the scoring rubric. Evaluative criteria shows no alignment to the concepts outlined. Only 1 application of data has been submitted aligned to the levels of rubric. However, faculty have not submitted a second application as required by CAPE. Okay, there's a case where this assessment only submitted 1 application of data on an initial report. This wasn't a conditional. This must have been an initial report. And they didn't submit the second application of data. Okay. Also, you'll notice that they submitted data charts at the district level, and this is a building level report. So look for that too. Are the assessments designed for the proper level that the report was submitted? If they submit a building level report, they have to have building level assessments, building level data, building level scoring rubrics. If it's a district assessment, then they have to submit district assessments. So look for that. You sometimes will get a mix and match there as well. Okay? So what I've tried to do is give you sample wording that you can copy and use when you find these same problems. And what I'm showing you are the most common problems that we find with assessments. Okay? Any questions? No? Okay. Here is another sample, and it's kind of the same thing, 2 applications. I think I've already done that. So let's talk about looking at, that was all about 2E, 2E, the assessment activities. So the first thing here's some questions you can ask yourself as you're looking at the assessment description, assessment tool activity section of that assessment. Ask yourself the question. Number 1, is the focus of this assessment set at either content level or skill level? You know, look at just the activity itself. If this is an assessment 3, and assessment 3 is a skill assessment designed for looking at instructional leadership skills, is the focus of this assessment activity geared toward that? I mean, is it focused right? If it is, that's great. If it's not, that's an issue, and you need to write that. Second question to ask yourself, are the assessment activities and tasks outlined of sufficient depth and breadth to evaluate candidate mastery of either content knowledge or leadership skills outlined in those standards. That would be the standard concepts, the element concepts. We already talked about that a little bit, but each element has a concept, and we want that assessment activity to align to that concept found in that standard element. Tips for reviewing scoring rubrics or scoring guides. Ask yourself the question, does the scoring guide or rubric, is it designed to measure candidates' responses on the assessment activities? Does it relate back to the activities or tasks outlined in the assessment tool Part E? Okay. We don't want just common rubrics that are just generic. There's been an issue with generic rubrics in the past, and basically what they've done is they take our standards and they just design rubrics. And then they say, well, this generic rubric could be used anywhere. Well, no. We want the rubrics to measure candidates on what they do on that assessment activity. So the way you find that is in the first column of the rubric. What are the measurements? Are they measuring our standards alone, or are they measuring the assessment activities outlined in Part 2E? There should be relationship back to that assessment activity. And if not, that's an issue. Secondly, the question to ask yourself in the scoring rubric or guide, whatever, is are the measurements aligned to our standard elements? Whichever standard element they say in the scoring, in the assessment activity, they say that they're measuring. There's just sometimes we'll get scoring rubrics that have no relationship to the activities, but also don't have any relationship to the assessment standards. They measure things like writing or research or any, quality of, the activity, but they have nothing to do with our standards. So that is a common problem that we've had in the past and will probably continue to have. So look for it. We need the rubrics to relate to measurements that relate to our standards. That's what the purpose of it is. And lastly, are the criteria that they use within the levels of that rubric, do they relate to the evaluative criteria that we give them in those scoring rubric starters? And we don't need to see all of the diamonds, but we need to see a majority of the diamonds, and we would look for that, okay? So that's the three things you're going to look for in scoring guide rubrics. Let's talk about data charts. Okay, so the data charts you get, if it's an initial report, hopefully they have 2 applications of data. If they don't, then that's an issue. But basically in the data chart, we want the data charts to be set up like the scoring guide. So if in the scoring rubric they give you a 4-point rubric, a 4-level rubric, 4 levels, and then they list the standards, the data chart should have data for 4 levels and all those elements that they list in the scoring rubric. So they need to align to each other. They need to look alike, So that's what that second point is the data chart aligned to the rubric levels and the standard elements outlined in the scoring guide. And then have they provided 2 applications if it's an initial report and 1 application if it's a conditional or revised report. There's the data rule. I told you I would give it to you, and I'm outlining it right here for you to look at. So just memorize that. Since spring 2010, we've required 2 applications of data on all assessments if it's an initial report. And if it's a revised report or response to condition report, you would only be looking for 1 application of data. And it's only on those assessments that they have to revise or have to respond to. And if it's a conditional report, it could be even more narrow. Maybe the condition has nothing to do with data. Maybe the data charts were fine, but it was the scoring rubrics that were the problem. So in that condition, they don't even mention data. So if the condition statement doesn't mention data, they don't have to submit data, and you can't make a comment about data. So conditions are very limited. I've always mentioned assessment number 5, effects on student learning, because it's just a little bit different. It is a skill assessment, but in this case, you're looking for an assessment activity or project or something where candidates are being measured, leadership skills are being measured in their ability to create an environment that supports student learning, either at the school building level or school district level. I do say that graduate employer surveys can be used I know Dick is listening to me, and so I make a big caveat on that. This is not a fairly, it is an acceptable assessment to the ELCC, but only if they can show you how the instrument is being used to measure leadership skills in supporting, creating an environment that supports student learning. So it can't just be a program satisfaction survey. You've graduated from our program. Has the program, are you satisfied with the program and has it prepared? That's not an appropriate assessment number 5. It is a graduate survey, but we would call it more of a program satisfaction survey rather than a true assessment of leadership skills in creating a supportive learning environment. So I have kind of mentioned all of the parts. Here is a sample C3 for assessment number 5. I put this one in here because remember I told you assessments 7 and 8 are optional. Well, here's where, in this section C3 is where you would write comments about the quality of those assessments if they submit them. Those are optional assessments. We don't require them to submit them, but if they do, your comments would go into part C3 after you've made a comment about assessment number 5. Okay? You will notice, look at assessment number 7. It says, while the assessment activities show some alignment to the standard elements, the scoring rubric lumps standard elements together. So here's a case where the assessment activities were great. They were aligned. They showed alignment to our standards, but there's a problem with the rubric. And they submitted 2 applications of data. So in this case, if all of the assessments were built that same way, this would be cause to give them nationally recognized with conditions because part of the assessments were done right. The assessment data charts were done right, and the assessment activities were aligned to our standards. So those 2 sections were done right. But there's a problem with the scoring rubrics, and so the condition would be to resubmit scoring rubrics to address the concern outlined in part C3 of the team report. Okay, and so if all of them were built that way, that would be a perfect reason to give nationally recognized with conditions. In other words, they're headed in the right direction. Part of their assessments they've done right, but there's this one area where they're going to need to revise and submit rubrics, and in that case, they wouldn't have to resubmit data, because they already did the data. But you'll notice how it's worded. The audit team can very easily see the quality of that assessment in all 3 parts, and they can see exactly what's happened, what's right, what's not right, and what they need to do. And it's said succinctly and easy to read, and we can just see from a nutshell, exactly what's happened. So in this case, let's say the team recommended, all the assessments were built this way, and the team said not nationally recognized. Well, if the audit committee were reviewing this and they read through this report and they saw that same comment for all the assessments, they would say, well, no, that's too harsh. They're doing some things right. We're going to overturn that decision and make it nationally recognized with condition, and the condition will be resubmission of the scoring rubrics. So there's a case, just an example of how the audit committee reviews your team report comments, these comments, and decides whether they either agree with your final recommendation or whether they want to change it. But your job is to write a quality team report and give them these kind of comments so they can see what they're dealing with. If you leave out a comment about the quality of the assessment activity, they won't know that quality, and so it makes their job harder. If you don't make a comment about the scoring rubrics for each of these assessments, well, then they won't know what that quality is, and that becomes a real concern. And if you haven't made any comment about the data, well, then we have to do a re-review. And believe me, the audit committee does not want to spend its days doing re-review of team reports because, it's too much time, too much work. And so we really need your comments to be of this depth and quality so that we can see what's going on in that assessment. We can see whether, whether it's aligned or not. We can see about the quality of it. But so just write a note to yourself that you need to make a comment in all 3 of those areas for every single assessment that's submitted. Now, let's say they had submitted an assessment that was not focused in at the right level. Let's say they submitted a test for assessment number 3, and they call that, instructional leadership. Well, you would have an added comment in here and that says, while they submitted a test for assessment 3, it does not meet the depth and breadth of focus outlined in this assessment for instructional leadership skills, or something like that. I mean, I'm not probably saying it as well as I could, but what I'm saying is you can add comments to these. This is just the minimum, okay? All right, so I told you that I would also tell you about where you can make other comments, that have nothing to do with our standards, have nothing to do with our assessments. If you had a comment to make about Standard 7, you would not be making that comment in Part C3, C2, or C1. There you would be making that comment in Part B, back where you're reviewing each element, okay? Let's say there's a comment that you want to make about the quality of the teachers. Nothing to do with our standards. It's really something just about anything you've reviewed outside of our standards. There's a section in the report, and I call it Part E, Areas for Consideration, and that's where those comments belong. Okay, these are just general good practice comments. Just remember to be circumspect about them, because again, you're talking on behalf of the ELCC. You're not talking on behalf of your team. You're talking about on behalf of our SPA, and it's for the whole profession, the profession of educational leadership. So they should be global, and they should be issues that our profession agrees is good practice, sort of things. Okay. So that comment about adjunct professors and how they have no full-time faculty and none of them are in this program. That could be a comment that you could make. It's just good practice. This does not get addressed in any of the revised report or response to condition reports. So let's say you're reviewing a revised report and you review back on the last team report and you note a comment in Part E. You're not looking for any Part E comments to be addressed, okay? So just make a note to yourself on that as you're reviewing reports. No Part E comments have to be responded to by the institution, and reviewers are not allowed to make comments from previous team reports about Part E. Part F are additional comments, and most of the time these two sections are blank. We are very circumspect about these kind of comments, very circumspect, especially F2. Those are instructions that these comments go right back to the Board of Examiners on their on-site visit. No initial report should include these comments. Maybe a revised report or a conditional report might have these comments, but the audit committee looks very stringently at these comments, and they will wipe them out if they don't like the way they're written. So, okay, go back. I just wanted to do Part D. Part D is, remember I told you about Section 5 and the analysis of the data across it? Well, this is where you would evaluate that section, and here's some questions you can ask yourself as you're writing it. Just think about that, these things. So that is basically the team report in a nutshell. And I've given you areas where you can, how samples of writing so that you can take pieces and use it if you find these common problems. Let's talk about the common problems. I've talked about it a little bit. For reviewers, data is not aggregated. We don't look for individual student data in those data charts. We don't want to see individual student data. We want to see aggregated numbers or aggregated percentages for each of the elements. And then we also want elements data to be at the standard level as well. So assessment activities and scoring rubrics are not aligned to our standards. Very, very common. They might be aligned to the standard as a whole, or the assessment activities might show no relationship to any of our standards. That's a very common one too. They'll give you activities, they'll give you rubrics, and they have no relationship to any of our standards or elements. Nothing. I hate to say, but that's a very common problem. And I just put that out to you, especially on initial reports. Another common problem is lumping standards together, where they're reviewing, in one measurement, well, one activity will list a whole bunch of standards, and they'll just list them. And then when they get to the scoring rubric, they'll just list, portfolio, ELCC 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, and they'll just lump them all as one measurement. And then the evaluative criteria are they did it really well or they didn't do it really well. And it's just very vague, very vague. So that's a standard problem. I wanted to end the webinar basically talking about how to write condition reports or revised reports. These are comments from CAPE, actually. And we want your findings to be clear, precise, objective, standards-based, and evidence-based, okay? Especially on a conditional report. Conditions tend to be high stakes, and revised reports are high stakes for an institution. So there we want to know really specifically, because this is a second review or sometimes a third review that they've gone through. If you say there's a problem, we want to know really what is going on. Why is it a problem? You can't just say there's a problem with the rubrics, or there's still a problem with the rubrics, or there's why? What have you found? So be specific in terms of telling us what it is you see and why that is not good enough, okay? And if you can, always relate it back to the standards. I've had conditions where I've actually written out, I quoted them what they wrote, and then I've quoted the standard and said, there is still a lack of alignment between the concept, quote unquote, da-da-da-da-da, and this standard ELCC 1.1, which asks candidate to develop, articulate, and then I quote the standard. You know what I mean? So they can actually see, here's what you wrote, and here's what our standard is, and there's still no alignment. Okay? So in conditional reports and revised reports, I've gotten a little bit more sometimes detail, because obviously if they're still not getting it, they need more information. They need to know why. Okay? We just zero in on the conditions, and I've kind of mentioned that before. Reviewers can't reverse previous decisions on MET standards or on MET assessments. So this is where, let's say the condition is that they have to resubmit scoring rubrics for assessments 2, 3, and 4. And they do that, but they also resubmit the assessment activities. And you'll notice as you read those assessment activities that they're different than the original report. And they really have nothing to do with our standards. And you'd love to make a comment on it, but you can't, because the assessment activities were already outlined and approved in the previous team report, and your condition is only to look at the rubrics. So you are forced to only look at making comments about the rubrics. You can't go back and say, well, we didn't like the assessment activity. They weren't required to submit assessment activities. They did. You can't look at it if it's a conditional report. Now, if it were a revised report, you could make a comment about that, because there's more flexibility. On whatever it is they resubmitted, you can look at and make comments about it, okay? Even if, let's say, they didn't need to submit comments on assessment 1 because it was previously met, but then they went ahead and decided to change it, and they submitted something on it, and it didn't look alike, it didn't look as aligned to the standards, well, you are open in a revised report to make comments about that, but not on previous decisions for condition reports, okay? So there it is, I think, pretty much in a nutshell. I'm at the end of my time almost. I'd like to open it up for questions from you. I want to make sure I've hit everything. I think I've hit everything I wanted to cover. Oh, I know what. I did want to show you an assessment, couple assessment charts to help you when you're doing your review. This little chart here is you can use to decide whether the content assessments are being met and the standards are being met in the content area and the skill area and the effects on student learning. And the way reviewers use it is they will check off the boxes, for each of these whether it's met or not met or met with condition for each of those elements. So first of all, you make sure that all of the standards, 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, 5.0, 6.0, are met at least in one of the 2 content assessments and again in one of the 3 skill assessments or 4 skill assessments. All the standards have to be covered twice, once for content, once for skill. And you can use this chart to kind of determine whether that is indeed being the case. So let's say, let me just put a sample in here. Let's say for standard 1, assessment number 2 addresses standard 1. So normally what I would do is I put an X here, meaning it's being addressed for assessment number 2. And then here, let's say this is met, this is not met, this is not met, whoops, and then this is not met. And over on the skill side, let's say assessment 4 addresses standard 1, and here it's met, whoops, met, met, met. Okay, so they've addressed it 2 times, but in this case, the majority of standard 1 is not met for content. And that's the comment that I would make for assessment number 2. See, for assessment number 2, I'd say, while standard 7 is listed as being covered in this assessment, the majority of elements, and then I might put in parentheses ELCC 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, are not sufficiently covered or not sufficiently aligned in the assessment activity. And so that's kind of how you use that for this chart, okay? And then down here, 7.1, 7.273, that's not covered in any assessments. Remember that. Those are just comments, and so I didn't put it in this chart because this is an assessment chart, okay? So that's one thing that might be very helpful for you to use. Another thing I have for you to look at, wait a minute, let me just see if are, oh, wait a minute, oh, sorry. The sample assessment, I wanted to kind of show you that. I told you that you would have one document for each assessment. And this is a narrative. So here's the overview section and responses to these, each of those questions. And then there's 2E, the assessment tool or activity. They're giving you the directions to the candidates. Then you'll go down and you'll notice here the parts of that assessment activity. And you'll notice there's a different part for each element. And I highlighted it so you can see. Then we get to the 2F, which is a scoring guide or rubric for that assessment activity. You'll notice in the first column they've related it back specifically to these activities. And they've copied each of those activities. This first part is related to 3.1. And then these are the evaluative criteria I was telling you about. Remember, and the standards, the rubric that has little diamonds? Well, I should see, and I do, I see the little diamonds within each of these levels, and that's the evaluative criteria that goes within the levels of the rubric, okay? Then we get to, and remember I told you about lumping? Well, what we want is we want data for each of these measurements, and this measurement relates to 3.1, this measurement relates to 3.2, and this measurement relates to 3.3. If you bunch and have one measurement with a whole bunch of standard elements all in one, it's lumping. You're lumping too much material, so you can't collect data by element. And that's what I mean by collecting data by element. You'll notice this data chart has the levels of the rubric, and it lists the elements down the side, and it's giving you aggregated totals, in this case numbers. The N is 6, and of that 6, here's the aggregated numbers. They could have also used percentages. We don't require that they use numbers. They could have used percentages, but in any case, you'll notice that they're giving the data by the element, but they're also giving the data by the standard, because when you make comments, your comments relate back to the standard as a whole. Your reviewer comments should relate to, okay, for standard 3, here's how the candidates did. 78% met the standard and 5% didn't. and we only found there were a small percentage, 3% or 17% that did not. But when you look at the next class, it was even lower, so it was even better. So that's what I meant by looking at the data. You'll notice this is an initial report. They submitted 2 applications. We don't require 2 years. We say 2 applications. That might be 2 semesters, that might be 2 years, that might be 2 teachers, that might be 2 cohorts. We don't say what that is. We just say 2 applications. Okay? So that's kind of an example of how to, of what a real assessment might look like. Okay? And it might not look like that, but that's just some things for you to look at. Are there any questions? Here's a question. Patricia asks, if the decision was further development required, can an EPP, and EPP stands for the SPA. That's what we used under NCAPE, we were called SPAs. Under CAPE, we're called EPP. Okay, if the decision was further development required, can an EPP submit a new report using the 2011 standards? That's a very good question. No. Well, it depends. I mean, Patricia, for a conditional report or revised report, that means they have already submitted an initial report. And so it's the conditional report or revised report is based on the shell that was created under the initial. So if the initial report was created under 2011, the conditional and revised reports all have to be 2011 too, because they're based on the initial submission. So if the initial submission was done on the 2001 standards, then the conditional report or revised report would be done on the 2001 standards. So it all depends on what the initial report, the standards that were used in the initial report. The conditional and revised report is using those same standards, and you can't switch midstream. If you want to switch midstream, you're going to have to end the process and resubmit a new initial report. Okay? But that was a good question. And probably not reviewer focused, but that's still okay. Any other questions that you guys might have? The other thing that I had sent to you via email was a program reviewer decision organizer. And I forgot to put that up here. But basically that's a, let me see if I, hold on one second here. Let me just see if it's on my, oh, actually it would not be on my thumb drive. It would be in here. Anyway, that Program Reviewer Decision Organizer is another helpful tool that you can use for reviewing each of the parts of an assessment, the assessment description, the scoring guide, and the data table. I've gone over all of the same questions that came from that decision organizer, so go ahead and open it up and look at it, but you will see that it's just basically a rating scale where you can rate 1 to 5 each of those sections, and it kind of helps you determine whether an assessment is good or not. Feel free to use it, and feel free not to use it if you don't want to, okay? But basically, that is it for this webinar. What you should expect now from here on out, basically, is I'm going to follow up this webinar with sending you via email 2 assessments to review. And I'm going to give you a blank report form, part C1, C2, or C3, depending on the assessment I send you. And I'm going to ask you to write up a statement about the quality of that assessment. I'm just focusing in on part C, okay? C1, C2, or C3. And then at the bottom of it, I'm going to ask you, it asks you whether, based on your finding of this assessment, would you grant national recognition with this conditions, or not nationally recognized? And I know this is a very incomplete process. I mean, it's not the whole report. And it's basically just to give you an opportunity to practice what you've learned in this webinar today. I will then apply a rubric for scoring it and then get back to you via email. But in between now and then, I encourage you to look over these comments, the PowerPoint presentation, all of the tools that we've given you, and look for the CAPE email on conflict of interest, and be sure to fill that out.